这 Frank 他怎么说明啊？
What's your name, sir?
Scott.
Hey, Scott. How you doing?
Yes.
You're a Sooner and a Cardinal at the same time.
Yes, sir.
Look at that. Go right ahead.
I have a question about free will.
Mm-hmm.
So, if God knows everything, then God already knows who's going to hell and who's going to heaven before He even ever created them, before He created the universe, before He created Adam.
Absolutely.
So, with this viewpoint, how could we all have free will at all if everything's already determined?
All right. Excellent question. Do you like football?
Yes.
Let's suppose you like NFL football, so you have DirecTV, so you can get, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And NFL Direct Ticket, right? So you can watch all the games on Sunday. One Sunday you're away from the TV, but you record the games that you want to watch later. And let's suppose you're coming home that night and your friend texts you all the scores, and you go, I didn't want to know the scores, but you know them now. And so you get home and you elect to watch one of the games. You already know what the score is going to turn out to be. Question, does that mean the players on the field don't have free will because you know the outcome?
No.
Okay, they still freely doing what they're doing on the field.
The problem is they've already done it.
They've already done it. And God's outside of time, so from His perspective, everything has already happened, even though it hasn't on our perspective, because we're in time, He's outside of time. So God knows the end from the beginning. That's how He can do prophecy, obviously. He's all-knowing as well. And just because it's already happened in His mind doesn't mean that He's causing us to do it directly. We still have free will. When God created you, if you're a believer, He knew you would be a believer. When God created Richard Dawkins, He knew Richard Dawkins would be an atheist. But you freely chose to be a believer, and Richard Dawkins freely chose to be an atheist. And so God is just. Just because He knows what's going to happen doesn't mean that we don't have free will. Does that make sense?
A little bit makes sense.
Okay, well, it's an analogy. It may not perfectly illustrate it, but if God's outside of time, He knows the end from the beginning. Now, you might say, why would God create somebody He knew would go to hell, right? That's a good question. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Now, well, God gives us free will. And let me ask you this question. Is God obligated to not create or allow us to create people through intercourse if somebody is going to turn out to be an unbeliever? Is God obligated to stop that creation? I don't think He is. Suppose the first two people are going to be Christians, and then the third person that comes along is going to be an atheist. Does that mean God can only make a universe of two people? No. Not only that, if you're a Christian, I can almost guarantee you, in fact, I can guarantee you wouldn't be here if it wasn't for atheists. Why? Because I'm sure there's atheists in your bloodline. There's unbelievers in your bloodline. There's unbelievers in my bloodline. Not only that, but God can even get His free will done through people who don't follow Him, or His will done through people who don't follow Him. An example of this from the Scriptures is Joseph. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, and somehow he makes his way to Egypt and gets into a position of prominence, and he puts grain aside in case there's a famine, and then there is a famine, and Joseph's own family, who sold him into slavery, come to Egypt to escape the famine. And Joseph sees him and says, you sold me into slavery. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, the saving of many lives that's going on right now. God can bring good from even the evil that we do and unbelievers do. And so God can bring good even from evil. So God allows people to be created because they freely choose to either believe Him or not to believe Him, even though He knows what they're going to do. He's a just being. All right? By the way, there's a book, if you want to go much further on this, Scott. It's called Chosen But Free. and it's written by my co-author, Dr. Norman Geisler, Geisler. All right, thank you.
神知不知道我们有自由意志的？如果神知道我们是有自由意志的话，那么神呢就应该呢，在某些方面会帮助好的人成功，对不对？神的子民成功，那帮助这样子罪恶、邪恶的人失败，公义可以得到伸张。可是问题就在了神呢是知道人类是有自由意志的，这个大师说的但是问题是呢，人为什么他常常会不愿意去听从神的旨意呢？那是因为他生活的环境里头会互相竞争嘛，就像足球赛一样。那比赛的时候，如果神告诉你说你会输了，但是呢别人会赢，可是呢你就放弃比赛了吗？因为你已经知道神说了你会输，他会赢，所以在这种情况下，你还是会努力的去比赛，就好像战争一样。我们刚才讲了，很多的战争势必只有一方会赢，另一方会输啊。如果每一方都抱持着神的旨意，就是之前我还叫杯吧问一下神，或者是看有没有灵通，找一些大师来问一下。结果这个提问之后发现，你呢可能失败的几率很大。那么你对于你的属下，可能就告诉我们说，我们要败了，赶快撤退吗？还是说我们坚持到底，即便是败，也要光荣的胜利光荣的失败就打到最后一兵一卒就是了。那在这种情况下的话，那么我们是不是要问一下，你要先知道结果要干什么？你知道结果之后，你就悲壮了嘛，对不对？你知道结果对你会不如预期的。但你如果不想要知道结果，那么尽力去做它。也就是说，我们回到最来的主题你把一件事情呢当成你跟别人合作，而其他人呢愿意呢去把它做到达成，那么我们把它分配这些其中的一部分工作，那么愿意去做到达成综合起来就是一个成功嘛。这就是你的自由意志，你的需要负担的一个想法。所以呢，我们为什么要讲到自由意志呢？因为有很多的人其实在他的情绪里头我们先停一下，先讲这个负面能量跟失败主义，先暂停一下那我们刚好还有一个视频有一个领导者可以给大家看一看那么来增广一下见闻就是了。领导者的意志我刚才转出来没转成呢。
Courage to lead. This one is embarrassing that it has to be on the list.
我觉得这一段话也非常的不错，可以给大家做参考。
The courage to lead. Embarrassing that it has to be on the list, but nonetheless it must. Because everything that I have explained to you today is unbelievably difficult. It is extremely hard to make decisions with a just cause in mind when so many of the pressures on all of us are pushing us to make the finite short-term decisions. If you work for a public company, the pressure is overwhelming from the outside to focus on the finite at the expense of the infinite. Sometimes we put pressure on ourselves to focus on the finite. We become so obsessed with the arbitrary goals we set for the end of the year that sometimes we abandon our own values in order to make the sale, gain the client, move the numbers. And if we do that too many times over the course of years, it's to the detriment of our own organizations, it's to the detriment of our own people. It is unbelievably hard to keep a just cause in mind as the guiding principle, especially if you have to make decisions that hurt in the short term. It is unbelievably to commit yourself to this lifestyle, this practice of good leadership where you obsess about the trusting teams. Like a family, it's never perfect. It's about human relationships. Sometimes it's confounding to us. And yet for us to acknowledge that our responsibility as leaders is not to drive the results, but to create an environment in which our people can work at their natural best is unbelievably difficult. It is so much easier to just hire and fire people willy-nilly and drive the numbers and create all kinds of incentive structures based solely on someone's performance, except for the fact that it drains the energy of people, it drains the trust of them, it inhibits cooperation and innovation, and eventually it runs out of steam. It's hard. It's much easier to direct all of that discomfort and anxiety we have about competitions and our weaknesses at others. But the problem is if we become so obsessed at winning, sometimes we do things that are quite unethical. If it's like running in a race where I'm obsessed with beating the other runner, I may resort to tripping him. I may win the race, but I'm still a slow runner. And in this game, there is no end of the race. It keeps going and going and going and going and going and going and going. And to change our mindset away from having competitors to having worthy rivals and being honest with ourselves about our weaknesses is unbelievably hard. The capacity for existential flexibility, most people in this room will never have to do it, not once. However, are you building your organization so that the organization and future leaders are prepared to be able to do it? Do the people know the just cause? Is it a culture of trusting teams so that future leaders can make the flex if they need to, even if you've never had to? That's the responsibility of leadership, to prepare the organization for the next leaders. If you are perfectly satisfied with the fact that when you quit, your company will go belly up, I got no beef with that. Just be honest about it. You're playing a finite game, and it's just for fun, and you're going to see how much you can accumulate in your time there, and then you're done. There's no problem with that. But some people have an ambition that the company can outlast them and even grow greater than when they ran it. Kind of like the same ambition we have for our children. That's hard. It's hard to maintain an infinite mindset. It's hard to adopt an infinite mindset. It takes unbelievable work, and it takes unbelievable courage. The company CVS, the chemists in the United States, had a vision statement, had a just cause that they would protect the health of their employees and their customers. And they kept finding themselves in these very uncomfortable meetings. They would be meeting with hospitals and doctors, and they'd have a wonderful meeting about how they could partner together, the chemists and the medical professionals. And at the end of the meeting, somebody would say, "Don't you sell cigarettes?" And so one year, they decided that they were going to remove all the cigarettes from all of their shops. It was a move that would cost them billions of dollars of revenue. Billions, with a B. Wall Street lashed out against them at the announcement. They stuck to their guns. Analysts said silly things like, those cigarette sales will now go to other places, predicting the future. And yet when all the cigarettes were moved out of their stores, something happened. Sales either stayed the same or went up. Turns out, all those cigarette sales didn't go somewhere else. What ended up happening is more people stopped smoking in the towns in which CVS has existed. In fact, what also happened is people were so enamored by the fact that they would make such a courageous decision based on cause and not money, that people spent more money at CVS or would travel out of their way in order to do business with CVS. And the employees spoke with remarkable pride about how much they loved working at this company that was so courageous, that was willing to do the right thing over the expedient thing. Their competitors, Rite Aid and Boots, their CEOs were interviewed and asked, are you going to remove cigarettes from your stores? Incidentally, both those organizations had vision statements on their websites, you guessed it, to protect the health of our customers. Same vision. And yet Rite Aid said, we're continuing to examine the situation, and we continue to sell smoking cessation products. In other words, they're going to sell a nicotine patch next to a pack of cigarettes, which is much like selling a donut next to a diet book, right? One is an impulse decision, the other one requires a little work. Turns out, even somebody who wants to go on a diet still buys a donut if you offer them the opportunity. Boots was even funnier. They said that we are selling cigarettes in compliance with all local, state, and federal laws. That's not courage. The law is a much lower standard than ethics. And this is one of the problems we have in the world today. That the standard of business is too low. The standard of modern business is predominantly driven by a theory proposed in the 1970s by a man named Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman was an economist who gave us the responsibility of business. He said the responsibility of business is to maximize profit within the bounds of the law. That is a very low standard. Let me show you what the bounds of the law produces. When the Titanic was built, it was considerably larger than all the other ships that existed in the day. And the regulations that governed lifeboats in the day were governed by size, and they didn't have a lifeboats for all provision yet. And the largest vessels of the day were ferries. And the Titanic was 4 times larger than the largest ferry. So what the Titanic builders did, expressly to save money, was put empty berths for lifeboats on the decks of the Titanic, but they only put enough lifeboats as required by regulation, which, as it turns out, was 1/4 of the number of passengers that they would be carrying. Because the regulation didn't require it, so they didn't do it. They knew that the regulation would eventually catch up, which is why they put the empty berths. We all know what happened in 1912. The Titanic struck an iceberg and sank, and guess how many people died? You guessed it, 75%. 25% survived. The Titanic broke no laws. In other words, the law is a very low standard. It is not high enough standard. And unfortunately, thanks to Milton Friedman and people who embraced Milton Friedman in the 80s and 90s, so many business theories were developed based on this standard, that the responsibility of business is to maximize profit within the bounds of the law. The concept of shareholder supremacy showed up, which means we prioritize the wants, needs, and desires of shareholders over the wants, needs, and desires of customers or even employees. This is like an owner of a football team trying to build a great team by asking the fans what we should do rather than asking the players what they need. Doesn't work so well. But because of the 80s and 90s, these boom years, the concept of shareholder supremacy became normalized. The ideas of using redundancies on an annualized basis in order to balance the books. Think about that for a second. We're going to use someone's livelihood so that we can meet our arbitrary projections at the end of an arbitrary time period. And companies use redundancies and layoffs even when they're profitable. They just weren't as profitable as they predicted. Think about the ethics for that for a second. Forget about the people who lose their jobs. Think about the unbelievable stress it causes to the people who kept their jobs. Because what they've basically been told is this is not a meritocracy and no one here is safe. Do you think they're giving you their all the next year? No. They're hiding from you. And they're lying to you. And they're faking every single day because that's the business model we've provided. The idea of rank and yank, where we promote the top 10% of performers and fire the bottom 10% of performers, became normalized in the 80s and 90s. The evisceration of regulations to protect us from speculative investing were destroyed in the 80s and 90s in the name of profit. And now we've had 3 stock market crashes in the past 30 years, where from the Great Depression up until the 1980s, we had 0. In other words, we have an outdated business model. Even GE itself, Jack Welch was hailed as a hero of business for everything that he proposed. He was a Milton Friedman acolyte. He became the poster child of what leadership looks like in the 80s and 90s. GE needed a $300 billion bailout in 2008, and who knows if it's even going to survive for the next 5 years. It was not a company built to last. It was a company built with finite mindset for finite success. We need to completely reimagine business as it exists. We need to reject the finite-mindedness of the 80s and 90s, and we need to embrace the infinite-mindedness for the next millennium. And the irony is, it's good for businesses. It's good for business. The organizations that are led with a finite, infinite mindset, those infinite-minded organizations tend to outperform their competitors over the long term. They tend to have much higher levels of innovation, much stronger teams where the people don't leave and quit at the slightest shudder. They hunker down and say, how can I help? And for those of us who have to work there, those are the jobs we love. All of this raises an interesting question. What does it mean to live an infinite life? Clearly, our lives are finite, but life is infinite. We're born, we die, but life continues with us or without us. Which means, though we don't get to choose the rules of the game, we do get to choose how we want to play in this infinite game. And we can choose to live our lives with a finite mindset or an infinite mindset. To live our lives with a finite mindset means we wake up every single morning trying to make more money than anyone that we know, to maximize the amount of power that we have, to gain power and sort of oversee the world, control the world, domination. And when we die, we leave it all behind. It's only fun while we're living. Can't take it with you. People hate us. It causes health problems. You look at a lot of these finite-minded entrepreneurs who've done really well in life and go look in their medicine cabinets. Look at the qualities of their marriages, or the relationships they have with their children. And it paints a different story. To live our lives with an infinite mindset means we wake up every single morning and think to ourselves, how can we have a positive impact on the people around us? That one day I can meet a remarkable entrepreneur, a remarkable business leader, and say, how did you become who you are today? And they will mention your name. They will talk about the lessons they learned from you, how they learned to be a better version of themselves, to take care of the people around them, and that everything that they've learned today came from somebody else. In other words, you have literally lived on beyond your own years. I had a chance to sit down with Sir Richard Branson, and I asked him a question. I said, how should we judge you after you die? I asked him. I said, what did you build at Virgin? What about Virgin are you most proud of that you will want to be remembered after you die? And he got very annoyed with me. And he said, do not judge me by anything that I have ever done at Virgin. He says, if you want to judge the quality of my life, you judge the quality of my children. That's an infinite mindset. Every single one of us has a choice whether we want to live our lives with a finite mindset or an infinite mindset. It is just a choice.
好了，那么我们大概了解了一下有关呢这个领导者的责任的一些重要的一个观点啊。接下来我们要来说这个负面能量与失败